Imagine Qing China at its height: calm rivers, serene mountains, bustling markets, and scholars debating philosophy while farmers worked peacefully. Life seemed timeless, yet cracks were forming. Corruption, bureaucracy, and internal strain quietly weakened the empire. Across the seas, Britain sought a product China could not resist: opium. Slowly and silently it spread, bringing addiction, greed, and conflict. This is the story of how a great empire was tested, and how courage, resilience, and tragedy shaped its fate. Yes, we will talk about how opium destroyed China's greatest empire. Before start, please like and subscribe my channel, Sleepsy. In the soft light of early dawn, long before factories, foreign ships, or the smoke of opium ever reached its shores, China rested in a gentle rhythm. The Qing Empire, vast and proud, stretched across mountains, rivers, and valleys like a great sleeping dragon. Its villages woke slowly each morning, the smell of warm rice drifting from wooden kitchens, and farmers stepping quietly into the fields, with tools passed down for generations. Roosters crowed in distant courtyards. Children chased one another along dusty paths. Water buffeted softly in small canals that fed rice terraces carved into the hills like steps rising to the sky. There was peace, not perfect, but steady, old and comforting. In the Forbidden City, the emperor watched over his realm from behind red walls decorated with gold. His court bustled with scholars in silk robes, holding scrolls filled with poetry, laws, and philosophy. They bowed low as they moved through long corridors, reciting ancient words meant to guide the empire. Many truly wished to serve the people with honesty. Others were less sincere. Beneath the harmony, small cracks were forming. Bureaucrats argued over minor details instead of facing big problems. Money meant for repairs sometimes disappeared into private pockets. Supplies arrived late. Decisions dragged on for months when they should have taken days. China still looked powerful, but inside, it was slowly becoming stiff and tired, like bamboo bending under too much weight. Far from the palace, villagers did not worry about politics. They cared about harvests, family meals, and the arrival of festivals when lanterns glowed like floating stars. They believed the Middle Kingdom was the center of the world. Everything important, they thought, was already here: tea, silk, wisdom, long history. Why look outward? But beyond the horizon, across wide oceans they hardly imagined, other nations were changing quickly. Their ships sailed far and fast. Their factories worked day and night. Their merchants searched for new places to trade, new markets, new chances to grow rich. These winds of change had not yet reached China, but they were coming, and with them came a shadow, small at first, like a cloud floating far away. A shadow that would grow larger and darker until it touched every home, every city, every family, the shadow of opium. For now, though, life moved gently forward. Farmers tended fields. Scholars wrote essays. Silk stretched on wooden frames. The empire breathed quietly, unaware of the storm forming beyond the sea. A storm that would not carry rain. A storm that would carry smoke. Many miles away, on the blue waters of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, foreign ships creaked as they rode the waves toward China's southern coast. Tall masts stretched toward the sky. White sails billowed like clouds. And on deck, sailors from faraway lands stood watching the horizon, thinking of the treasures waiting in China. These travelers were British merchants, Dutch traders, Portuguese explorers, and adventurers from across Europe. They had heard stories of beautiful porcelain that shone like moonlight, silk soft as whispers, and tea leaves that released warm, golden flavors when touched by boiling water. Europe loved Chinese tea. People drank it in grand houses, small homes, and royal palaces. They loved it so much that the British bought millions of pounds of it every year. But there was a problem. China did not want much from Britain. China already had fine clothes, strong metals, smart scholars, rich land, and beautiful crafts. What could Britain offer in return? Wool? Machines? China was not interested. So, British silver flowed steadily into China like a river that never returned. The British grew worried. Their silver supplies were shrinking. Their merchants panicked. They needed something, anything that the Chinese people would want to buy. But China allowed only one place for foreigners to trade, the city of Canton. The Canton system had strict rules. Foreign merchants could not wander freely. They could not meet Chinese officials directly. They had to work with approved Chinese middlemen called Hong merchants. Taxes were high, restrictions tight, and the emperor's message was clear: China needs nothing from the outside world. Foreign traders felt frustrated. They wanted freedom, profit, and influence. China wanted control, order, and respect. Still, trade continued. Tea leaving China, silver entering China. British warehouses grew empty. The East India Company became desperate. Somewhere, hidden in the back rooms of trading offices, a dangerous question began to form. What can we sell to China that they cannot refuse? The answer would soon arrive, and it would change history. Opium, a substance smoked quietly in small corners of India. A substance that made pain fade and thoughts float. A substance that brought dreams and chains. Foreign winds had touched China's door. Soon, they would blow it open. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. One trade ship, one shipment. One gamble that foreign merchants hoped would solve all their financial troubles. Hidden in wooden chests beneath tea crates and cotton sacks, dark bricks of opium traveled across the sea. When the ship reached China's coast, its cargo was not taken to the government warehouses. Instead, small boats met it in secret. Lanterns flickered on the water, while smugglers loaded the packages into their tiny vessels and carried them toward hidden docks. At first, only a few people bought it. Mostly wealthy scholars curious about foreign luxuries. They smoked it in private rooms, whispering that it helped them relax after long days of writing essays or studying ancient scrolls. Some said it made their thoughts clearer. Others felt light, peaceful, almost floating. Merchants noticed something important. People who tried it wanted it again. Word spread, slowly at first, quietly. But like a spark catching dry grass, it began to move. Sailors in the harbor tried it, then laborers, then men who worked long hours carrying heavy loads from ships to warehouses. They said it made their bodies feel less tired. They said it helped them escape their worries. Foreign traders saw the growing interest and smiled. They understood addiction well enough to know what it meant. Customers who never stopped buying. Ship after ship arrived. Each one carried more opium than the last. Chests stacked like small mountains in the storage rooms of secret dealers. The prices stayed low to attract new users. Smugglers earned fortunes. Middlemen built powerful networks. Corrupt officials looked the other way when silver coins filled their pockets. Opium dens appeared in narrow alleys of Canton, then in larger cities like Fuzhou, Xiamen, Shanghai. Inside, the air hung heavy with smoke. Lamps cast dim light on men lying on bamboo beds, pipes resting in their fingers, their eyes half closed as if drifting between sleep and waking dreams. A quiet fire was spreading. Some families noticed their fathers slipping away, coming home late, eyes foggy, money missing. Some scholars failed their exams because they no longer studied. Farmers who once rose before dawn began waking late, their strength fading as the smoke took hold. Still, the trade grew. Foreign merchants celebrated their profits. Chinese smugglers expanded their networks. And ordinary people found themselves caught in something they did not fully understand. The first drops of poison had entered the empire, and no one yet knew how far they would spread. The change did not come all at once. It arrived the way evening shadows creep across the ground, softly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. But by the time people looked down, the darkness had already reached their feet. Across the empire, from busy cities to peaceful villages, opium smoke began curling out of windows and drifting through streets. It slipped under doors, clung to clothing, and settled into the very rhythm of daily life. In small tea houses, groups of men who once gathered to discuss harvests or poetry now sat in silence, pipes in hand. Their conversations grew slower, their laughter faded. They seemed present, yet far away, as if half of them wandered in another world. Families felt the change most deeply. A farmer named Jen, who used to rise before sunrise, started waking later and later. His wife would shake his shoulder gently, whispering that the fields needed tending, but he only muttered and rolled over. His face, once full of strength, grew thin. His hands trembled. Tools lay untouched outside the house. In the home of a scholar named Liang, inkstones dried up as scrolls remained unopened. Once, Liang had dreamed of passing the imperial exam. He studied every night by candlelight. But after he began smoking opium, first just once, then again, his goals drifted away like smoke in the wind. The characters on the page blurred. Days slipped past. His family quietly removed the exam books from his desk, afraid they only reminded him of what he had lost. Fathers forgot to bring home wages. Sons sold family heirlooms to buy more of the drug. Daughters wept in secret as they watched their homes crumble around them. Even officials were not spared. Some smoked during meetings, hiding their trembling fingers inside their sleeves. Others accepted bribes from smugglers, looking the other way as opium boats slipped under the cover of night through river mouths and quiet bays. A system meant to protect the people instead allowed their suffering to grow. Opium dens multiplied. Some were hidden behind cloth curtains in crowded alleys. Others were large, decorated rooms owned by wealthy dealers. Inside, bamboo beds lined the walls. Oil lamps glowed softly. The air shimmered from thick smoke, carrying a sweet, sickly scent. People lay motionless on the beds, pipes resting on their chests, small boxes of the drug placed carefully beside them. Some murmured in their sleep. Others stared at the ceiling, their eyes distant, as if seeing something no one else could. In the countryside, villagers noticed food supplies shrinking. Fields went untended, tools rusted, work slowed. Some families, unable to afford taxes or grain, sold land that had belonged to them for generations. Mothers tried to shield their children from the sight of men collapsing in street corners. Grandparents whispered about how different things had been in their youth, how strong and proud China used to be, how disciplined and hard-working the people once were. Yet, the smoke continued to rise, and with every pipe lit, with every chest unloaded from secret boats, the empire slipped a little further. Some Chinese officials sent reports to the capital describing the problem. They wrote of addiction, of families ruined, of money disappearing into foreign hands. But many of these reports never reached the emperor. Corruption, fear, or simple neglect buried them along the road. Still, a few voices grew louder. A teacher named Madame Hua wrote poems describing the sorrow she saw in her village. A doctor named Shen tried to help addicted men, only to learn there was no medicine that could heal their suffering. A small group of honest officials begged local governors to act, but their voices were small, and the opium trade was vast. Silver flowed out of Chinese pockets and into foreign coffers. Prices of daily goods rose. The economy wobbled like a table with one broken leg. Markets grew unstable. Crime increased. People grew desperate. Yet most foreign merchants saw little more than profit. They watched the numbers climb, thousands of chests, then tens of thousands, and celebrated. More British ships arrived, each carrying greater quantities of opium. The traders assured themselves they were not harming anyone. They claimed the Chinese people were responsible for their own choices. They said it was only business. But deep inside, some knew the truth. This business was built on broken families and ruined futures. In the heart of Canton, a young clerk named Yun walked past an opium den every morning on his way to work. At first, he ignored it. Then he grew used to it. Then, slowly, he began to dread it. One evening, as he walked by, he saw a boy no older than 10 dragging his father out of the den. The man's legs did not hold him. His head hung forward. The boy, crying silently, whispered to him again and again, "Please, Baba, please come home." Yun stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. That scene stayed with him for years. It became one of the many quiet images of sorrow that spread across China during those years. Small, unseen moments that together formed a nation's slow collapse. And yet, in the halls of the Forbidden City, the emperor still believed the empire was stable, strong, safe. He did not yet know that the shadow had grown too large to ignore, but soon, very soon, someone would force him to see it. For many years, the Forbidden City felt far away from the troubles growing across the land. Behind its tall red walls, life moved slowly and carefully. Ministers in long robes walked through echoing halls, courtyards filled with the soft sound of sweeping broom bristles. Eunuchs moved silently from room to room, carrying messages and scrolls. But even in that peaceful place, whispers began to rise. Some officials brought reports with trembling hands. They described villages sinking into poverty, soldiers losing discipline, and scholars failing their exams. They wrote about silver draining out of China, leaving local markets unstable. They mentioned softly at first the growing fog of opium. Most officials, however, tried to avoid the topic. They feared angering higher ministers. They feared blame. They feared the emperor's displeasure. Still, the truth kept slipping through cracks in the palace walls. One morning, Minister Jiang, an elderly man with a thin white beard, stepped into the hall of state. He bowed deeply before Emperor Daoguang and laid several scrolls at his feet. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Your Majesty," he said, "the addiction among your people grows worse each year. Families collapse. Soldiers desert. Even some officials." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Even some officials fail in their duties because of this poison." The emperor's face tightened. He had heard rumors, of course. He had received letters, scattered and incomplete. But he had not realized how deep the problem had become. He ordered the scrolls opened. Inside were stories from every part of the empire. Villages starving, families breaking apart, criminals growing bolder, silver vanishing, and opium dens multiplying like weeds after summer rain. The emperor grew silent. He dismissed the court early that day and returned to his private chambers. For a long time, he sat beneath a painted silk lantern, reading the reports again and again. Outside, the sky darkened, but he did not order candles lit. He simply read and worried. The government had banned opium before, not once, but many times. But the bans were weak. Local officials often ignored them. Some accepted bribes from smugglers. Others were addicted themselves. And foreign merchants grew bolder with every passing year, certain that China could not stop them. Finally, the emperor called his Grand Council together. Ministers gathered around a long table, their faces severe. They debated for hours. Some said the empire should tighten bans, arrest users, destroy opium pipes, and punish smugglers harshly. Others argued that banning opium had failed many times, and that the government should regulate it instead, perhaps even tax it. A few ministers trembled silently, afraid their own names might appear on the lists of smokers. The debate grew louder, then quiet, then loud again. Voices overlapped, sleeves brushed against scrolls, tea cooled untouched beside them. After a long pause, Minister Zhang finally spoke. "We are losing more than silver," he said softly. "We are losing the strength of our people." The room fell silent. For the first time, the emperor looked at his ministers not with anger, but with a deep sadness. "What use is a mighty empire," the emperor asked, "if its people are weak?" No one answered. That night, the emperor issued a decree demanding stricter enforcement of opium laws. Officials were ordered to burn seized opium, close dens, and punish corrupt colleagues. Soldiers received renewed discipline. Patrols increased along the rivers and coastline. But even the most loyal officials knew the truth. They were fighting a giant with tiny weapons. Smugglers had fast boats, hidden warehouses, and connections stretching from India to Canton. Foreign traders operated from anchored ships beyond Chinese law, protected by distance and diplomatic confusion. Local officers, paid poorly, often looked the other way, and addiction had taken root in the hearts of millions. Still, pockets of resistance formed. A magistrate named Rui led raids on opium dens in his city, refusing bribes and dismissing corrupt subordinates. A group of villagers built a wall around their community and barred opium sellers from entering. A young officer named Li vowed to keep his soldiers away from the drug, checking their belongings every week. These small sparks shone brightly in the darkness, but they were not enough to light the whole empire. Meanwhile, the British traders celebrated every new crackdown. They knew stricter bans only pushed opium into deeper shadows where they held the most power. Some British merchants even smiled when they heard of Chinese officials burning opium, believing it would only increase demand and desperation. They congratulated each other in their cabins, raising glasses of wine over the misery of distant families. Back in Beijing, the emperor read report after report, each one heavier than the last. He realized something painful. The empire could not solve this alone. He needed someone strong, honest, and unafraid of confrontation. Someone who would not bow to bribes, corruption, or foreign pressure. And so, late one night, as lanterns flickered in the palace halls, Emperor Daoguang lifted his brush and wrote a name on a dispatch that would soon change China's fate. Lin Zexu, an official known for discipline, integrity, and courage. A man who could not be bought. A man who believed deeply in protecting the people. The emperor sealed the letter with a carved jade stamp and handed it to a trusted messenger. "Go," he said, his voice heavy with hope and fear. "Tell Commissioner Lin that the empire needs him."
And far away in Fujian province, Lin Zexu would soon read that message, unaware that his mission would bring China to the edge of war and change history forever. While China struggled quietly beneath the weight of opium, thousands of miles away, another empire watched with sharp eyes. The British Empire, vast and ambitious, stretched across continents. It ruled seas, commanded armies, and collected wealth from every corner of the world. But even great empires have weaknesses, and Britain had one weakness that troubled it deeply: tea. British people loved Chinese tea. They drank it in the mornings, in the evenings, during meetings, during rest. Tea had become part of daily life. The problem was simple. Britain had to pay for tea with silver. China accepted nothing else. And slowly, silver began to flow out of Britain like water from a cracked pot. Merchants panicked. Bankers worried. Politicians whispered in private meetings. How do we get China to buy something from us? What can we sell them? What product do they need? The answer arrived like a dark seed planted in the minds of traders: opium. The British East India Company already grew opium in large fields in India. Workers harvested the poppy sap, shaped it into cakes, and packed it carefully. At first, the company traded it for profit inside India. But soon, merchants saw that China, huge, crowded, and troubled, was the perfect new market. Although the Chinese government banned opium, Britain saw the ban not as a warning, but as an opportunity. A banned substance meant high prices. High prices meant high profits, and profits were what the company loved most. Soon, British-controlled opium farms expanded. The fields in Bengal and Malwa grew wider. More workers were hired. More crates were packed. The drug was loaded onto ships bound for the southern coast of China. But the East India Company used a clever trick. They didn't smuggle the opium directly themselves. Instead, they sold it at auctions in India to private British merchants, men who were not official representatives of the company. These merchants then carried the opium to China, claiming the company had nothing to do with it. It was a thin disguise, but it was enough. And so, ship after ship left India with hundreds of wooden chests stacked like silent soldiers in the cargo hold. Each chest held enough opium to ruin hundreds of lives. On the voyage, British merchants gathered on deck, sipping wine and discussing profit. China's demand is rising, one would say with a grin. Good, very good, another replied. As long as they buy, we win. None of them spoke of the ruined families. None spoke of the addiction spreading like a quiet sickness. Their eyes were fixed only on gold, silver, and growing bank accounts. Meanwhile, in London, debates swelled. Some members of Parliament argued that the opium trade was immoral. They called it cruel and shameful. But others defended it with cold logic. If China buys opium, that is their choice. If they ban it, that is their problem. We only provide what the market demands. And the loudest argument of all, we need to restore the silver balance. Profit defeated morality. Back in China's waters, British ships anchored just beyond legal reach. They waited in floating warehouses called receiving ships. Chinese smugglers paddled out to them in small, quick boats under the cover of darkness. Deals were made. Silver changed hands. Chests moved silently across the waves. The trade grew, then doubled, then tripled. By the 1830s, over 30,000 chests of opium entered China every year. British merchants celebrated. They built grand homes in India. They sent their children to fine schools. They dined on fine meals and toasted to success. But behind every toast was a trail of suffering stretching thousands of miles toward the Chinese coast. One merchant, a younger man named Captain Harris, sometimes stared out at the sea with a troubled heart. He saw the fishermen paddling through moonlit waves, their faces tired, their pockets empty. He saw Chinese smugglers begging for lower prices, clutching silver earned from selling misery. But when Harris returned to the company office, with its big ledgers and bigger expectations, he pushed those doubts away. Everyone is doing it, his colleagues told him. This is how the world works. Money is all that matters. And slowly, Harris let his conscience grow quiet. Back in London, newspapers printed stories praising the growing power of Britain's trade. Stock prices rose, investors grew richer. The empire's hunger grew sharper. But a few journalists wrote troubling lines. China may react. China may resist. China may fight. Their warnings were ignored. For the British Empire believed China was too weak, too slow, too old to oppose them. They believed ships powered by steam and guns made of iron would handle anything. They believed the opium trade was a perfect plan. But every perfect plan has a flaw. While Britain's ambition rose like a mighty tide, a single man in China was preparing to stand in its way. A man honest enough to refuse bribes, brave enough to challenge powerful merchants, loyal enough to defend his people at any cost. His name was Lin Zexu, and though he didn't know it yet, he was about to collide with the biggest empire on earth. The news traveled slowly at first, carried by tired riders over dusty roads, whispered by clerks in government halls, and spoken softly in crowded tea shops. But before long, the entire empire knew that the emperor had chosen one man to face the growing storm of opium. a man whose name carried the weight of honesty itself, Lin Zeshu. In the quiet city of Fuzhou, where the river curved gently through green hills, Lin Zeshu lived a life of discipline and calm thought. He was known for rising before dawn, reading until the lamps flickered out, and speaking in a voice that rarely grew loud, even when dealing with the most stubborn officials. Some people said his eyes seemed to read not only letters on a page, but also the hearts of men. When the imperial messenger finally reached his home, Lin was sitting in his study, surrounded by stacks of reports on local corruption. The messenger knelt and held out the yellow imperial decree. Lin took it with steady hands. In the quiet crackle of candlelight, unfolded the decree and read the emperor's words. "Go to Canton. Stop the opium that is poisoning my people." For a long moment, Lin did not move. The candle flame wavered, and the room seemed to fall into a deeper silence. He had known that the problem was growing, but he had not imagined the emperor would place such a burden in his hands alone. Still, he bowed his head. "If this is the burden of the empire, then I will carry it." A journey toward a sickened coast. Lin left Fuzhou within days. His journey south was long, passing through towns where the air felt heavy and the people wore tired expressions. Though he traveled with an official escort, he often asked them to stop so he could speak with villagers along the roadside. He saw things that troubled him deeply. A farmer told him he sold his tools to buy opium for his addicted son. A scholar whispered that half the young men preparing for exams had begun to smoke. A shopkeeper admitted that officials themselves had grown too weak with addiction to enforce any laws. Wherever Lin went, he felt a quiet sadness spreading across the land, like mist creeping over fields at dawn. At night, he wrote notes by lamplight, each one more alarming than the last. The closer he came to Canton, the more serious the situation appeared. He already knew he was not prepared for what he would see. The city by the sea. Canton was unlike any other city in China. It was loud, crowded, and leaning toward the sea like a giant marketplace eager to meet the world. Foreign ships lined the harbor, British, American, French, and many others. Merchant houses rose above the waterfront, painted in foreign styles and filled with goods that had traveled across oceans. But there was something else, too. An uneasiness hung in the air, as if the city were caught between two worlds. Chinese merchants feared losing their livelihood. Foreign traders feared that their profits were threatened. And ordinary people, shopkeepers, porters, fishermen, feared something they could not see clearly but could feel pressing on them. Lin Zeshu entered the city with no fanfare. He wore simple robes, not the ornate ones many officials preferred. The people watched him with curiosity. Some whispered that he carried the emperor's anger. Others whispered that he brought hope. Witnessing the damage. Before meeting any merchant or foreign official, Lin did something unexpected. He walked through the streets of Canton alone. He visited the smoky back alleys where men lay slumped in opium dens, eyes half open, minds drifting far from the world. He saw workers who could no longer lift tools, mothers crying as their husbands sold their bedding for one more pipe, and young boys whose fingers shook as if even their bones carried the poison. One night, Lin entered a small, dim room where a once brilliant scholar lay on the floor, trembling. The man tried to rise but failed. With a weak voice, he whispered, "I only wanted to try it once. Just once." Lin knelt beside him and gently took his hand. "This is not your shame," he said softly. "It is the shame of those who brought this poison." When he left the room, he paused at the door, breathing slowly, his heart heavy. That night, in his private journal, he wrote, "If the smoke of this drug continues to rise, our nation will fall." The emperor's mandate. The next morning, Lin gathered his assistants and read aloud the emperor's command. Opium must be stopped, no matter the cost. His voice remained calm, but those in the room could feel the firmness beneath his words. Some grew nervous. The foreign merchants were powerful, wealthy, and supported by governments across the sea. China, despite its size, had grown weak in its defenses. But Lin showed no fear. Instead, he said, "We do not fight for silver. We do not fight for pride. We fight for the health of our people, and that is a fight that cannot be delayed." A promise to his people. Before taking any official action, Lin visited the Pearl River shoreline at sunset. The water shimmered gold beneath the fading light. Fishing boats rocked gently, and the scent of salt filled the air. Lin folded his hands behind his back and took a deep breath. He thought of the emperor who trusted him. He thought of the children who deserved a future free of poison. He thought of the long road ahead, one lined with conflict, resistance, and misunderstandings. But still, he whispered into the evening breeze, "I promise, I will protect this land, even if the storm rises against me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, a soft wind blew across the waves, carrying the scent of the sea. It felt like a gentle calm before something much larger, something he could not yet see but sensed approaching. The storm was coming, and Lin Zeshu was the one man standing in its path. When the sun rose over Canton the next morning, it painted the sky in pale pinks and golds. The ships in the harbor rocked quietly, unaware that a long-awaited confrontation was about to begin. The city woke slowly, fishermen preparing their nets, shopkeepers opening their doors, and foreign merchants sipping tea on their balconies. But inside the Governor-General's compound, Lin Zeshu was already at work. He sat at a large wooden table, his sleeves neatly folded, a brush in hand. His calm face hid the weight of the task ahead. Before him lay reports, names of merchants, records of shipments, whispers from informants. Candle wax had hardened on the table's edge, showing he had worked through the night. When his assistant entered, Lin asked quietly, "Are the merchants ready?" "They are waiting, Commissioner." Lin nodded slowly. "Then let us begin." The gathering of the merchants. The foreign merchants arrived in small groups. Some came confidently, with polished boots and fine coats. Others looked anxious, unsure of what this new Chinese official intended to do. They gathered in a large hall that opened onto a courtyard filled with bamboo trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Lin Zeshu entered without fanfare, his presence quiet yet commanding. The merchants rose. He motioned for them to sit. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, "this meeting is not to accuse, but to understand." He unfolded a document and read aloud. "Opium is destroying the lives of our people. The emperor has commanded me to end this trade completely. I ask each of you today, will you support us in stopping this poison?" A soft murmur spread through the room. Some merchants shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead, their faces expressionless. One British merchant finally stood. His voice was firm but polite. "Commissioner Lin, opium is not produced by us. We merely trade it. You must understand the demands of the market." Lin looked at him with calm eyes. "Markets can demand anything," he replied, "but not everything that is demanded is good. Tell me, would you sell poison to your own people?" The merchant hesitated. Others avoided eye contact. The bamboo trees outside rustled as if whispering an answer the men could not give. Evidence, letters, and truths. Lin began questioning them one by one. He presented documents showing the scale of addiction, lists of ruined families, and numbers that made even hardened traders grow silent. Some merchants grew defensive. Some tried to deny responsibility. Others admitted quietly that the profits were too great to refuse. By the time the meeting ended, Lin had learned the one truth he feared the most. The merchants would not stop voluntarily, not for morality, not for warnings, not for the suffering of millions. As they left the hall, some looked uneasy, others whispered angrily. A few walked away with heavy steps, knowing something serious was coming. Closing the factories. The next step came swiftly. Lin issued a bold order. All opium-related trade in Canton must stop immediately. Foreign trading factories, large buildings where the merchants lived and worked, were to be sealed until they complied with Chinese law. Guards quietly surrounded the factories at dawn. Doors were locked, windows barred. The merchants woke to find themselves trapped inside their own quarters, forbidden from leaving. The foreign community erupted in panic. "What right do they have to imprison us? This is an outrage. Trade must be free." But despite their shouts, the guards remained calm, their instructions clear. Lin had given them a message to deliver. Hand over all opium, and you may leave. Inside the sealed compounds, merchants argued late into the night. Some wanted to comply. Others feared losing their fortunes. A few wrote desperate letters to their governments, begging for intervention. But outside the walls, the people of Canton waited in silence, hoping, perhaps for the first time in years, that change might come. The letter to Queen Victoria. During this tense period, Lin Zexu wrote a letter that would echo across history. Sitting alone in his study, he dipped his brush in ink and began to write to Queen Victoria of Britain. His hand moved steadily, his words respectful but firm. He described how opium was destroying China's people, how the trade was unfair, and how no nation should profit from another's suffering. He wrote, "We have heard that in your honorable country, opium is strictly forbidden. Since you do not permit it yourselves, how can you ship it to another land?" His question was simple, yet powerful. When he finished the letter, he sealed it carefully. He hoped the Queen would read it with understanding. He hoped she would stop the merchants. He hoped peace could be saved. But the letter would never truly reach her in time. Growing misunderstandings. China and Britain did not see the world the same way. To the Chinese, trade was a privilege granted by the emperor. To the British, trade was a right that no nation could restrict. To the Chinese, morality came before profit. To the British traders, profit was the lifeblood of empire. These differences grew like cracks in stone, splitting the two sides further apart with every passing day. Foreign merchants accused Lin of oppression. Chinese citizens praised him as a hero. British newspapers began printing stories portraying him as dangerous. Chinese poets wrote verses calling him the guardian of the people. The tension thickened in the warm Canton air, pressing on everyone who lived near the harbor. A city holding its breath. Night after night, the foreign factories glowed with candlelight as merchants debated what to do. Many were frightened, a few grew defiant. Meanwhile, Lin Zexu remained calm, often walking alone along the riverbank at dusk. He knew the storm was nearing. He knew the merchants were cornered, and he knew this confrontation could open a wound that would cut deep into the heart of China. But still, he whispered the same promise he made when he first arrived. "I will protect my people." As the moon shone over Canton, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, wondering what Lin Zexu's next move would be. The answer would soon come, and it would change the course of history. The air in Canton grew heavier with each passing day. Clouds drifted low over the harbor, hiding the sunlight as if even the sky sensed something immense was about to unfold. The foreign factories remained locked, guarded quietly but firmly by Chinese soldiers who stood watch day and night. No one went in. No one came out. Merchants paced behind barred doors, their arguments rising like restless waves. They were surrounded, powerless, and uncertain. And through all this tension, Lin Zexu remained composed, his steps steady, his voice calm. He had asked the merchants to surrender their opium peacefully. They refused. Now he would act. The final ultimatum. On a cool morning, Lin issued his final announcement. All opium, every chest hidden in warehouses or aboard ships, must be surrendered. No trade could continue until the poison was handed over. Guards posted the message across the city. Translators delivered copies to the foreign quarters. The merchants gathered around the notices, reading them with disbelief. A Scottish trader rubbed his forehead in frustration. An American merchant slammed his fist against the table. A Portuguese dealer muttered prayers under his breath. But the message was clear: either give up the opium or remain imprisoned indefinitely. For the first time, many realized they could not wait any longer. Business had stopped. Supplies inside the factories were running low. Letters sent to their governments would take months to reach home. They were alone. At last, the foreign merchants sent word. They would surrender their opium. The great confiscation begins. What followed was unlike anything China had ever seen. From every warehouse near the Pearl River, from secret storage rooms and hidden compartments aboard anchored ships, chest after chest of opium was dragged out. The sound of wooden crates scraping against stone echoed across the docks. Some merchants watched with pale faces. Others turned away. A few wept quietly, not for the suffering caused, but for the fortune they were losing. Chinese officials documented every chest with careful precision. They counted, weighed, and recorded each shipment in neat writing. Soldiers stood by, their expressions solemn, as if they too understood the gravity of this moment. When the final tally was made, the total stunned everyone. Over 20,000 chests of opium. Enough to fill an entire warehouse. Enough to destroy generations. This was the largest drug seizure in world history. The long walk to Humen Beach. Once collected, the chests had to be destroyed. Lin Zexu chose Humen, a quiet spot near the sea, where the Pearl River met the open waters. It was far enough from the city to avoid chaos, but close enough for the public to witness the government's resolve. Convoys of carts rolled toward Human Beach, carrying the heavy chests. Villagers paused their work to watch the long line pass. Children perched on fences, pointing with wide eyes. People whispered, "Is this really happening? Will this truly end the suffering? Can we finally breathe again?" Hope flickered in many hearts for the first time in years. The massive ditch at Human, workers had dug a vast trench, so large that hundreds of men could stand inside it. It stretched like a scar across the sand, waiting for what would soon fill it. Over several days, chest after chest was brought to the ditch. Soldiers cracked them open with axes. The smell of opium, heavy, sweet, strangely bitter, rose into the air. To many bystanders, it was the scent of their nation's pain. Workers poured salt and lime over the opium bricks. Water from the river was channeled into the trench, creating a swirling, muddy pool. Slowly, the opium dissolved into a dark liquid that flowed out toward the sea. The outgoing tide carried the poison away. Chinese citizens watching with hope. Crowds gathered on the hills overlooking Human Beach. Old men leaned on canes. Mothers held children by the hand. Scholars stood with folded arms, nodding with approval. For once, China was fighting back, not with weapons, but with resolve. Many had lost loved ones to addiction. Others had seen once prosperous homes fall apart. To them, watching the opium dissolve felt like watching their sorrows drift away with the tide. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood in silence, letting the moment wash over them. And Lin Zeshu, standing near the water's edge, watched with a calm, gentle expression. He had not come for glory, he had come to protect. Foreign merchants react with fury. But not everyone saw hope. On the foreign ships anchored farther out at sea, British merchants stood on deck, binoculars raised. When they realized what Lin was doing, shock turned to anger, then outrage. "He's destroying our property. This is an attack on trade. This is a direct insult to the British crown." To them, the opium was not poison. It was profit. It was power. It was the foundation of their empire's trade. They wrote furious letters to their superiors. They argued that their rights had been violated. They claimed their honor had been wounded. Their anger rose like a storm wind, gathering force and speed. But down on Human Beach, the destruction continued, calm and steady, day after day. Lin Zeshu's resolve. When the last chest was emptied, when the final traces of opium flowed into the sea, Lin Zeshu stood silently watching the waves. The wind tugged at his robes. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky gold. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for victory, but for healing. He knew this act would not go unnoticed. He knew Britain would respond. He knew a storm was forming across the sea. But he also knew something else. He had kept his promise. He had protected the people, at least for now. As night fell over Human, lanterns flickered in the breeze, and the last traces of opium faded into the darkening tide. China had taken a stand, but the world beyond its shores was preparing to strike back. The calm before the storm had ended. The true storm was still on its way. After the opium was destroyed at Human, a quiet tension settled over Canton. To the citizens, it felt like a long-held breath finally released. They walked through streets with lighter steps, hoping their families might finally be safe. But across the seas, far from the calm rivers and bamboo-lined streets of southern China, the British Empire was awakening to fury. In London, merchants, politicians, and shipowners gathered in grand halls. Candles flickered on polished tables as papers were shuffled, and voices grew louder with every passing hour. "This is an insult to our trade," a merchant cried. "Our property has been destroyed," another shouted. "How can they interfere with British merchants like this?" a banker demanded. Across the room, a quieter voice reminded them, "The emperor acted according to his law, but we cannot let this stand. Our empire's honor, our profits, everything is at stake." And so, slowly but surely, the wheels of war began to turn. British Parliament responds. The British government was alarmed. Ship owners threatened to stop trade altogether if their losses were not repaid. Merchants demanded compensation. Newspapers printed stories accusing China of arrogance, injustice, and disrespect for British citizens. The Parliament debated late into the night. Some members argued that Britain must act with caution, that diplomacy should be the first path. Others disagreed. "Words alone will not retrieve our losses," a voice thundered. "Only action, only force will restore balance." And with that, a plan formed. Britain would send a fleet. Steam-powered ships, bristling with cannons, would sail to China's southern coast. They would force the ports open and demand trade on British terms. Across the empire, preparations began quietly, methodically. Gunpowder was stocked. Soldiers were readied. Officers studied maps of Canton and the surrounding waters. The British Empire was about to enter China. China's preparedness, or lack thereof. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Qing court read reports from Canton with alarm. The news of Lin Zexu's destruction of the opium had already reached the emperor. Now, rumors of British plans made the court shiver. Generals and admirals scrambled to prepare. Forts along the coast were reinforced, but resources were limited. Soldiers, trained for traditional battle, were unfamiliar with steamships and modern cannons. Many had never faced the firepower of the British Navy. Local militias were called to duty, but their loyalty was uncertain. Some had been paid with silver lost to opium. Others had relatives addicted or sickened by the drug. The once proud defense of the empire felt fragile, almost brittle. Inside the palace, the emperor paced the halls. The weight of the empire pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had sent Lin Zexu to protect the people, and Lin had done his duty. But now, the consequences loomed larger than anyone had imagined. First clashes at sea. It was a foggy morning when the British fleet first appeared on the horizon. From Canton's shore, the masts of foreign ships rose like dark fingers against the pale sky. The water shimmered silver, hiding the engines and cannons that would soon roar. Civilians watched from rooftops and docks, curiosity mixed with fear. Soldiers lined the beaches, unsure what to do. Cannons were fired in warning, but they were little match for the long-range guns of the British steamships. The first shots echoed across the water. Wooden junks shivered under the force of metal shells. Smoke drifted over the harbor, curling like restless spirits. Chinese soldiers, brave but unprepared, struggled to coordinate. Orders were shouted, confusion spread, and the ships continued to advance steadily. The shock of modern naval power. Lin Zexu, though not a general, observed the battle from a safe distance. He had predicted resistance, but the scale of the British fleet and their power shocked many. Steamships moved faster than wind could carry, and their cannons fired with precision. Villagers hid behind walls. Merchants prayed quietly. The river, once a place of calm trade, became a scene of chaos and fear. Chinese commanders realized that their traditional defenses, high walls, cannons, and river patrols, were no match for this new kind of warfare. Panic began to spread. Some officers fled. Others hesitated, unsure if they should follow orders or protect their families. The calm before total conflict. Despite the chaos, Lin remained calm. He walked along the riverbanks after the first battle, observing both the damage and the reactions of the people. He saw families huddled in doorways, sailors coughing from smoke, and merchants crying over ruined warehouses. In his journal, he wrote, "We have acted for the good of the people. Now we face consequences we cannot avoid. Let courage and patience guide us, for the storms have only begun." This quiet reflection was his strength. While the city trembled around him, he held a vision of protecting the nation, even if the coming battles would bring more fear and suffering. A nation on the edge. By nightfall, the British fleet had established control over several key positions along the coast. Fires burned where misfired cannons struck. Smoke mingled with fog, creating a scene both beautiful and terrible. Canton's citizens slept lightly, listening to the distant sounds of war. Parents held children close, whispering, promises that one day the storm would pass. And through it all, the people began to understand the cost of opium. Not only the poison itself, but the foreign greed it had attracted. The calm of human beach had ended. The opium was gone, but a storm greater than anyone had imagined was now sweeping across China. And at the center of it all stood Lin Zexu, disciplined, determined, and resolute, ready to face the challenges ahead. The morning air was heavy with mist, curling gently along the Pearl River and softening the shapes of Canton's busy harbor. But beneath that peaceful appearance, a storm had truly begun. The British fleet, powerful and modern, moved steadily into position, while the Chinese defenders braced themselves for a conflict they had never faced. The people of Canton watched from rooftops and riverbanks, their faces pale, their hearts full of worry. Mothers clutched children close, shopkeepers whispered prayers, and fishermen paused in their boats. A city that had once thrived on trade now held its breath. Steamships meet wooden junks. The first clash came quietly at first. British steamships glided across the water, their iron hulls glinting in the soft morning light. They carried cannons that could fire farther than the old wooden junks of the Qing Navy could even see. The Chinese warships responded with courage, but their wooden structures and outdated guns were no match for the British power. Shells tore through masts and sails, splinters flying like rain. Smoke drifted across the water, curling over the terrified faces of villagers on the shore. The river seemed to tremble under the force of cannon fire. Ducks scattered from the water. Small boats were overturned. And yet, amidst the chaos, Lin Zexu remained calm, observing carefully, recording what he saw, understanding that knowledge could still guide strategy. Cannons and confusion. Every battle is a lesson, and this first engagement taught the Chinese a hard truth. The world had changed. The British used steamships not only to move faster, but to position their cannons with deadly precision. Chinese forts along the coast tried to respond, but smoke from their own guns made it difficult to see. Orders shouted from the walls were lost in the roar of cannon fire. Soldiers were brave, but confusion spread, and some could not follow commands. Villagers crouched behind stone walls and bamboo fences. The sounds of battle, a mix of booming cannons, splintering wood, and shouting, filled the air. Children trembled, clutching their parents, while elders whispered that perhaps, finally, the opium trade had awakened the empire's enemies. Ordinary people caught in the middle. It was not only soldiers who suffered. Ordinary people, who had long endured the quiet pain of opium's effects, now faced the open chaos of war. Market stalls were burned or abandoned. Homes near the river were damaged by flying debris. Families fled their houses at the first sound of cannon fire. Some villagers tried to help, pulling the wounded from the streets. Others ran to hide, hoping the noise would pass. Lin Zexu walked through these areas with a quiet dignity, speaking softly to the frightened people. "You must stay calm," he told them. "We cannot stop what is coming, but we can survive it with courage and care." His calm presence gave the people something they had almost forgotten: hope. The Qing commanders struggle. Chinese commanders, experienced in traditional warfare, were struggling to understand this new kind of battle. The British had brought not just steamships, but tactics that seemed impossible to predict. Their ships moved where the river current could not reach, and their long-range cannons struck without warning. Some commanders hesitated, some panicked, some gave orders too late. Mistakes were made, and each mistake cost lives. Ships were lost. Soldiers fell into the water. Smoke and fire mingled over the river, turning the calm waters into a scene of chaos. Yet Lin Zexu's presence reminded everyone that even in confusion, there was a purpose. He moved among officers and villagers alike, his voice gentle but firm. "Learn from this. Protect what you can. The people must survive." British forces advancing steadily. The British forces were disciplined and steady. They advanced along the river and coast with precision, their ships forming lines that moved like clockwork. Every action had a purpose, every cannon fired with careful aim. As the hours passed, the Qing forces began to retreat in some areas, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. Villagers watched ships retreat from some docks, while British vessels moved forward. Fear mingled with awe as the people realized the scale of the foreign power. Yet in some areas, soldiers fought bravely, protecting homes, civilians, and smaller towns. The courage of the people was quiet, understated, almost invisible in the roar of cannon fire, but it was there, a constant undercurrent, like the river beneath the waves. The calm amid chaos. As night fell, the sounds of battle softened. Smoke hung over the river like a low cloud, and lanterns glimmered on the shore. The city of Canton, battered but still standing, was quiet again for a few brief hours. Lin Zexu walked along the riverbank, reflecting on what he had witnessed. The power of the British was terrifying, yet the bravery of the Chinese soldiers and the resilience of ordinary citizens inspired him. He knew the battles ahead would be longer, louder, and more devastating. He also knew that opium, which had brought this conflict into existence, would continue to poison his people if left unchecked. In his heart, he whispered a promise once more. We will endure. We will protect our people. Even in the face of the storm, we must remain steady. A nation at a crossroads. That night, Canton slept uneasily. The river, once a place of trade and calm reflection, had become a symbol of both destruction and hope. Families whispered prayers, soldiers tended to the wounded, and Lin Zexu prepared for the next steps with careful thought. The Opium War had begun. It was not just a fight between soldiers and ships, it was a battle for the soul of the empire. Every choice would ripple across cities, villages, and homes. Every action would leave marks on the people for generations to come. And as the moon shone over the calm river, Lin's eyes reflected both determination and sorrow. He understood that history was moving swiftly, and that the future of the Qing Empire rested on courage, wisdom, and patience. The storm of war had fully arrived, and the empire would never be the same. The once bustling coastal cities of China now bore the scars of conflict. Smoke drifted lazily from damaged docks, and the smell of salt and burnt wood hung over the harbor. Canton, Ningbo, and other key ports had fallen under British control, leaving Chinese soldiers weary and civilians trembling. The calm, steady rhythm of daily life had been shattered, replaced by the sharp crack of cannons and the distant cries of those caught in the crossfire. For the ordinary people, the war was not a story of nations or empires. It was a personal tragedy. Families had lost fathers, brothers, and sons. Merchants who had once thrived now sat behind boarded windows, hoping the fighting would pass. Children huddled beside mothers, who whispered reassurances they themselves struggled to believe. Economic collapse. As the British seized key ports and waterways, trade faltered. Silk, tea, and porcelain, once the pride of China, could no longer flow freely to foreign markets. Silver, which had long served as the lifeblood of the economy, drained from cities faster than it could be replaced. Farmers could no longer sell their harvests. Markets stood empty. Taxes went unpaid. Officials scrambled to maintain records, but the numbers no longer made sense. In Beijing, reports of lost revenue arrived daily. The treasury, already weakened by corruption and mismanagement, began to feel the strain. Couriers delivered urgent messages from coastal governors, warning of potential famine and unrest. The economic collapse was not distant. It was immediate and relentless. Panic in the imperial court. The emperor, Dao Guang, grew increasingly frail. Each report of lost territory, each note of burning ports, weighed heavily on him. Advisors argued late into the night. Some urged continued resistance, holding on to pride and tradition. Others warned that further delay could invite complete disaster. "Your Majesty," an advisor said, bowing deeply, "the foreigners are unlike any we have faced. Their ships are faster, their cannons stronger. We cannot fight them with our current forces." Dao Guang nodded slowly, eyes clouded with worry. "But if we surrender, our people will suffer the shame of defeat," he replied softly. "If we fight, they may suffer even more. What is the path of honor?" The palace, once a place of grandeur and serenity, now felt like a fragile house trembling in a storm. Courtiers whispered anxiously, servants moved quickly to deliver messages, and the emperor's health waned under the weight of impossible decisions. The psychological toll on the people outside the palace. The people felt the consequences of imperial weakness. Villages along the rivers were raided by bandits, emboldened by chaos. Families abandoned farms to flee the fighting. The once structured society began to fragment, leaving citizens vulnerable and uncertain. Even those who were not directly affected by cannon fire lived under a quiet tension. Every message of lost city, every report of plundered village, made hearts grow heavy. People whispered to each other about a great empire slipping through their fingers, unable to protect them or their way of life. Yet, amidst the fear and despair, there were small acts of courage and kindness. Neighbors shared food, mothers protected children. Scholars continued to write quietly, recording events for future generations. Even in the shadow of collapse, humanity endured. Lin Zexu's vigil. Lin Zexu remained a figure of calm amid the turmoil. Though not a general, he moved between military leaders, couriers, and villagers with measured steps and steady hands. He advised commanders, comforted civilians, and carefully observed every new development. At times, he would pause by the river, watching the gentle flow of water as if it could offer answers. He knew that the empire's fall was not just a product of cannons and foreign ships. It was also the slow erosion of trust, discipline, and unity within the nation. Even as cities fell, Lin held a quiet hope that China could learn from these trials, that recovery could begin after the storm passed. But he also understood the painful truth. Some losses were irreversible. The emperor's worsening health. Each day, the emperor's presence grew weaker. The stress of decisions, the weight of his empire's failing defenses, and the sorrow of knowing his people suffered visibly took a toll. Physicians attended him constantly, offering herbs, massages, and prayers, yet nothing could fully ease the strain on his mind and body. Advisors feared that his illness would force hasty decisions. They whispered among themselves about treaties, compromises, and surrender. Some proposed negotiations with the British to save what remained of the empire. Others insisted on defending honor, even at the cost of greater destruction. Dao Guang, sitting by a small window overlooking the palace gardens, murmured to himself, "An empire that was once strong, now trembling. How can I guide it through this storm?" China forced toward negotiation. With the fall of multiple coastal cities, China's military options dwindled. Ports that had once fed the economy now served as bases for British forces. Naval defenses, unprepared for modern warfare, were overwhelmed. Cities became vulnerable, and the citizens' lives increasingly depended on the mercy of foreign powers. Reports reached the emperor daily. Soldiers retreating, merchants pleading, villagers starving. Even loyal generals admitted they could not stop the advancing fleet. The realization settled like a shadow over the court. China had no choice but to negotiate. The path forward was frightening. The negotiation would require surrender, indemnities, and concessions that would humiliate the once proud Qing Empire. It was a bitter reality, but the alternative, continued warfare, promised far greater suffering and destruction. A nation on the brink. By the end of this chapter in history, the empire that had once seemed eternal was trembling. Key coastal cities lay in ruins. Families suffered in silence. Economic collapse threatened famine and unrest. The emperor, weakened by grief and responsibility, faced impossible choices. And yet, even amidst despair, small flickers of hope remained. Leaders like Lin Zexu continued to act with integrity. Citizens displayed courage and solidarity. Scholars and historians recorded events carefully, ensuring that the lessons of these trials would not be forgotten. The empire was breaking, but its story and the courage of its people was far from over. The calm bedtime tone helps the listener feel the weight of history while keeping the narrative reflective rather than overwhelming. After months of fear and destruction, a quiet negotiation began. The British fleet still commanded the seas. Their ships lined along the Chinese coast like silent gray sentinels. Inside the imperial court, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. Emperor Dao Guang, pale and weary, listened as envoys spoke in measured tones. The empire, once so proud, now faced a new reality. Peace, yes, but at a cost that would linger for generations. The city of Nanjing was chosen as the site for discussions. The British demanded compensation, control of ports, and rights to trade freely. Chinese officials, exhausted by war and aware of their vulnerable position, tried to preserve as much dignity as possible. Every word, every gesture, carried weight, shaping the future of both nations. The terms of the treaty. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, changed the map of Asia in ways few could have imagined. China agreed to pay a vast indemnity to Britain, a sum that would strain the treasury and ripple through the economy. Hong Kong, a small island off the southern coast, was ceded to Britain, marking the start of a long colonial presence. Ports that had once been tightly controlled by the Chinese government were now open to foreign trade, bringing merchants and goods under British regulation rather than imperial oversight. To the people, the treaty was more than just a document. It was proof that their empire, which had seemed eternal and unshakable, had been forced into submission. Pride was wounded, and uncertainty about the future spread quietly among the population. The pain of realization. For Emperor Dao Guang, the treaty was a bitter pill. The opium trade, once just a distant problem, had brought war, loss, and humiliation. The ships he had hoped to defend against had forced him into concessions that affected millions. In the palace gardens, he walked slowly along stone paths, reflecting on his choices. Advisors whispered about rebuilding the navy, fortifying ports, and preventing future conflicts. Yet the emperor knew that this treaty marked a turning point, not just in military terms, but in China's global position and its self-image. Families in the cities and villages felt the impact too. Merchants who once relied on trade now faced new rules and taxes. Farmers selling goods to the ports learned that foreign ships would dictate terms. Ordinary citizens, already worn by war and famine, could only wonder what the future held. Opening of ports. The opening of ports, part of the treaty, meant that foreign merchants could now operate more freely than ever before. Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen became gateways for Western goods, culture, and influence. The people who lived near these ports noticed changes immediately. New ships arrived daily, carrying fabrics, machinery, and tea. British officials walked the streets with authority, enforcing rules the Chinese had once set themselves. New languages and customs appeared in the marketplace, blending uneasily with traditional life. To some, this influx promised opportunity. To others, it brought fear of losing control over their land, their laws, and their culture. The treaty had not only shifted power, it had changed daily life for millions. Hong Kong's cession. The cession of Hong Kong was perhaps the most visible symbol of the new era. Once a quiet island, it became a foothold for Britain, a reminder that even distant lands could influence China's destiny. Chinese citizens and officials alike watched as buildings were constructed and flags were raised. The island became a hub of trade and a base for British operations, symbolizing both economic opportunity and foreign dominance. For the people, Hong Kong was no longer just an island. It was a sign that their empire could be challenged, and that the world beyond their shores was changing faster than anyone had imagined. The beginning of a century of humiliation. The Treaty of Nanjing did more than end a war. It marked the beginning of what later historians called the Century of Humiliation. China, once the unchallenged Middle Kingdom, had been forced to bow to foreign powers. Opium had been the spark, but the consequences were profound. Social structures began to shift. Corruption increased as officials struggled to enforce new rules. Merchants and villagers alike adapted to a world in which foreign influence was unavoidable. Yet, even in the shadow of humiliation, small acts of resilience emerged. Families rebuilt homes, scholars documented events. Citizens sought ways to maintain dignity and tradition despite changing circumstances. The empire's spirit was tested, but it was not yet broken. A reflection on loss and change. The Treaty of Nanjing was both an ending and a beginning. For the British, it was a triumph of power and profit. For the Chinese, it was a lesson in vulnerability and the costs of internal weakness. The citizens who had witnessed battles, confiscations, and occupation learned that no empire, no matter how grand, could ignore the forces of the world. And yet, amidst loss, there was hope. Hope that lessons could be learned, that reforms might follow, and that future generations might restore dignity to the empire. Lin Zexu, long after the treaty was signed, reflected quietly on his role. He had fought for the people, resisted opium, and acted with honor. Though the empire had suffered greatly, he hoped that one day his actions might be remembered, not just for the conflict, but for the courage, morality, and care that had guided him. Calm bedtime reflection. As night fell over Nanjing, lanterns glimmered in the quiet streets. The river reflected the soft light of the moon, hiding the scars of war beneath its calm surface. Citizens, tired from months of fear, whispered to their children that tomorrow would bring another day. The empire had been forced to negotiate. Cities had fallen, ports were open, Hong Kong was gone, but life, in small ways, continued. The people adapted, endured, and hoped. The Treaty of Nanjing had changed Asia forever, teaching lessons about greed, power, and resilience. And in that quiet night, even as the wind stirred gently over the river, there was a sense that history, like the tide, continued to move, slow and inevitable, carrying both loss and possibility together. Even after the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, the effects of the Opium War did not fade. The war had ended on paper, but the wounds it left ran far deeper than any treaty could heal. Cities were still scarred, economies disrupted, and families struggling to recover. For the people, the return to normal life was slow, painful, and uncertain. Across China, opium continued to poison the population. Despite Lin Zexu's heroic efforts, the trade did not stop completely. Smugglers found new ways to bring the drug into the country. Addiction, which had once quietly crept through households, now spread with frightening speed, affecting rich and poor alike. Scholars, merchants, farmers, and laborers all fell victim, their ambitions, savings, and health eroded. Social order collapsing. The social fabric of the Qing Empire, already fragile from corruption and inefficiency, began to fray further. Families faced breakdowns as addiction stole fathers' incomes and mothers' peace of mind. Villages saw young people disappear into opium dens, their futures uncertain. Officials tried to enforce bans, but many were bribed or indifferent. Local law enforcement faltered. The courts became overwhelmed, unable to manage rising crimes linked to addiction and poverty. Bandits roamed countryside roads, preying on travelers and merchants. The empire's once structured order seemed to crumble under the weight of human suffering and the relentless influence of opium. Rebellions emerge. It was in this atmosphere of chaos that the seeds of rebellion began to grow. Discontented peasants, angry at heavy taxes, corrupt officials, and the devastation caused by foreign powers, began to organize. These small uprisings were the early murmurs of something much larger, a rebellion that would challenge the empire from within. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted a few years later, drew strength from the despair left by the Opium War. Millions of lives would be touched by its fury, but its roots lay in the deeper wounds the war had inflicted. Poverty, social injustice, and the moral decay caused by opium created the perfect conditions for revolt. Economic and moral consequences. Economically, China struggled to rebuild. Silver flowed out to pay the indemnities demanded by Britain. Trade remained controlled by foreign powers in newly opened ports. Local industries collapsed under competition and neglect. Farmers and merchants struggled to recover their livelihoods, and the population faced famine in some regions. Morally, the country was shaken. Families blamed themselves for succumbing to addiction. Officials questioned their own integrity. Scholars lamented the loss of traditions and the weakening of Confucian values. The opium that had first appeared as a luxury item had grown into a symbol of corruption, moral decay, and foreign intrusion. The human toll. Beyond the economics and politics, the war left deep emotional scars. Children grew up without fathers, and women often had to manage households alone. Communities that had once supported each other now faced suspicion and fear as people struggled to survive in an unstable world. Stories of lives destroyed by opium became common. Mothers cried over sons lost to addiction. Fathers despaired at losing their livelihoods. Villagers whispered about neighbors who had vanished or fallen into debt. Even in moments of quiet, the people carried the shadow of war and opium with them, a reminder of the fragility of life and society. The beginning of the century of humiliation. Historians later called this period the beginning of the century of humiliation. China, once proud and confident, had been exposed to the power and influence of foreign nations. The Opium War had taught harsh lessons, that internal weakness could invite disaster, that moral decay could have national consequences, and that the world beyond its borders was no longer something to ignore. Opium had not only damaged the body and mind of its users, it had reshaped society and politics. The Qing Empire, which had ruled peacefully for centuries, now faced the reality that it could be challenged, exploited, and humiliated on the global stage. Small sparks of resilience. Yet even in the darkness, small sparks of resilience appeared. Families tried to rebuild. Villagers shared what little food remained. Local leaders attempted to restore order, even if their power was limited. Scholars recorded events, ensuring that future generations would understand the lessons of this period. Lin Zexu, remembered by many as a hero, continued to inspire hope. His example of moral courage, dedication to the people, and steadfast resistance to opium became a beacon, showing that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, integrity and compassion could survive. Reflection on lessons learned. As the dust settled, the nation had learned painful lessons. Greed, foreign pressure, addiction, and corruption could bring down even the mightiest empire. Families, officials, and soldiers alike faced consequences for choices they had made, or failed to make. The war had changed not only borders, but also the hearts of people. It forced China to confront its weaknesses, adapt to a changing world, and consider how to protect its society from further destruction. It was a period of reflection, mourning, and preparation for a future that would demand vigilance, courage, and wisdom. Bedtime style, closing thought. As night fell over the villages, towns, and cities, a gentle quiet returned. The river flowed silently, reflecting the moonlight as if it could wash away the scars of war. Children, tucked into beds, dreamed softly. Mothers whispered reassurances that tomorrow would bring calm. The deeper wounds of the Opium War remained, but the spirit of the people endured. In the quiet moments, the memory of courage, resistance, and hope lingered, reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, resilience could survive. China had been wounded, but its story was far from over. Lessons had been learned, scars had been earned, and the next chapter of history awaited, slowly, patiently, like the tide returning to the shore. The long, quiet nights of China's villages and cities now carried echoes of a painful past. The Opium War had ended decades earlier, yet the memories lingered in streets, rivers, and families. For the citizens, the war and its aftermath were not just stories in history books. They were lived experiences, carried in the hearts of those who survived and whispered to the children who followed. Even as new leaders rose and reforms were attempted, the lessons of opium's arrival, spread, and the foreign conflicts it provoked remained vivid. China had once been the Middle Kingdom, confident and unshakable, but opium had shown that strength alone was not enough. Moral, social, and economic health were equally important, and neglect in these areas could leave even a great empire vulnerable. The lasting scars. Opium left marks that were visible and invisible. Physically, countless lives were broken by addiction. Fathers who could not provide, sons who could not study, mothers who could not sleep for worry. Socially, families and communities struggled to rebuild trust and unity. Economically, the drains on silver, trade disruption, and the imposition of foreign rules continued to echo for decades. The Qing dynasty, already challenged by internal corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency, faced new pressures. Citizens began questioning authority. Scholars debated reforms. Merchants adjusted to foreign influence. And slowly, the empire's once steady rhythm began to shift into a more cautious, uncertain pace. Opium is both a weapon and a warning. Opium had been more than a substance. It had been a weapon, used both intentionally and unintentionally. It weakened the people, drained the economy, and invited foreign interference. Its story served as a cautionary tale for future generations, that indulgence, greed, and external pressures could combine to bring even the mightiest civilizations to their knees. Yet it was also a teacher. The empire learned hard lessons about governance, public health, and vigilance. Lin Zexu's courage remained a reminder that moral integrity and determination could still make a difference, even if the results were not immediately victorious. The human spirit endures. Despite destruction, China's people endured. Villages rebuilt homes, cities, repaired walls and docks. Families reconnected. Scholars wrote about history and ethics, hoping to prevent repetition of past mistakes. Through hardship, ordinary citizens developed resilience, creativity, and determination to survive. Even in the darkest years, small acts of kindness and bravery continued. Mothers comforted children, neighbors shared food, and villagers protected one another from the chaos that lingered after the wars. These small, quiet actions became the threads that held the social fabric together, showing that human spirit could withstand even the deepest wounds. Reflection on greed and vulnerability. The story of opium in China is, at its heart, a story of greed, vulnerability, and unintended consequences. Greed appeared in merchants seeking profit, in foreign powers seeking influence, and even in some local officials turning a blind eye. Vulnerability came from internal weaknesses, corruption, addiction, and slow adaptation to a changing world. When these forces combined, the results were catastrophic. Yet the reflection does not end in despair. Instead, it teaches that awareness, responsibility, and action are essential for any society wishing to protect its people and preserve its integrity. A gentle bedtime summary. As the empire slowly recovered from the storms of war and addiction, life returned to a quieter, gentler rhythm. Rivers flowed calmly, markets reopened, and the streets of villages echoed once again with the laughter of children. The scars remained, but so did the resilience of the people. Families told stories of courage and endurance. Children learned about Lin Zexu and others who had tried to protect their nation. Villagers remembered how opium had caused suffering, but also how solidarity, hope, and care could restore communities. In this way, history became not only a record of pain, but also a guide for the future. Even in the face of overwhelming challenges, life could continue, slowly and gently, like a river finding its course after a storm. Closing message. The tale of opium in China is not just about war, addiction, or politics. It is about human experience. It is about the fragility of societies, the dangers of neglect, and the courage of those who stand for what is right. For listeners in the quiet of night, there is a calm lesson to take. Even in the darkest times, resilience and hope can endure. Families, communities, and nations can heal if they learn from the past. As the moon rises over the river, lanterns glow softly in quiet homes. The story closes gently. The Middle Kingdom had been wounded, its people tested, and its future uncertain, but it had not been broken. And in the calm after the storm, the lessons of greed, vigilance, courage, and resilience drift slowly into sleep, carrying with them a quiet hope that even the deepest wounds can teach, guide, and inspire.